In this presentation, we'll be focusing on three-voice counterpoint. Writing two-voice counterpoint in a Baroque style provided us with the basic fundamentals that we'll need to be able to write the more complex three-voice counterpoint. We were able to focus on a few fundamental aspects of counterpoint really well when we were working with two voices. This included working with dissonance control, which ensured that we approached and resolved dissonant intervals in an idiomatic way to the style. We also focused on melodic construction, ensuring that we created stylistic horizontal elements, basically our melodies that we combined together, to form harmonies. We focused on working on harmonic implications, ensuring that we were able to both imply vertical harmonies and place them within idiomatic harmonic progressions. So we combined all of those things together, and that's what we worked on when we were working with two-voice counterpoint. The addition of a third voice, though, complicates things, but also opens up some opportunities. First of all, we now have the opportunity to form complete triads. We could only imply those before when we were working with two voices. So this addition to the texture means that we can now voice complete triads. However, it means the texture itself is more complex. There's more to think about with the addition of a third voice. So in this presentation, we're going to focus on the following aspects of three-voice counterpoint to hopefully help us make idiomatic three-voice counterpoint slightly easier. So we'll be focusing on harmonic tendencies, looking at some specific dissonance control practices that are unique to three-voice counterpoint and not present in two-voice counterpoint, and also looking at some textural considerations. First, let's talk harmony. So when we're working with a piece in three-voice counterpoint, if we have the option, it's great to allow ourselves complete triads. So if we are at particularly important structural harmonic moments, allowing ourselves to have complete triads using all three voices is a great idea. We don't always have to have this. We can leave out one of the chord members. If we want to leave out one of the chord members, remember our doubling practices from before when we were just working with part writing. These will come into play here. Our first option, if we want to double something, is to double the root. Now there's a little bit more flexibility after that. We'll see an example in just a moment where we see a doubled third, and sometimes we'll have a doubled fifth. But if we have the option, we want to try to double the root when we are working with three-voice counterpoint. We also have the option of voicing seventh chords in different ways. So a few voicing options that we can have sort of in order of preference is we could omit the fifth. Since we only have three voices and a seventh chord has 4 notes, we have to choose one of those notes to leave out. Omitting the fifth is a great idea. That makes sure that we have the root, we have the seventh, which would define the fact that it's a seventh chord, and if we have the third, it will help us define the quality. Less preferable would be to omit the third, and perhaps even less preferable than that is to double the root, omitting both the third and the fifth, and only having the seventh. This is pretty rare and would only be used fleetingly. In general, though, where it's possible, try to imply the triad or the seventh chord and its quality as strongly as you can, whether that's using a complete voicing or omitting a chord member so that it works with the counterpoint. Let's take a look at how Bach treats this in his Sinfonia number 1. Here's what this sounds like, slowed down. Now we're going to focus on a few specific harmonies within this context. I'm going to box those right now. These right here. Here's the first box, the second box, third box, fourth, and fifth. So we're going to focus on those where we have all three voices present. Note that we only had 2 voices present at the beginning of this Sinfonia, which is perfectly common. We'll talk about that a little bit more later, that sometimes the texture doesn't have to have all 3 voices going all the time for it to be three-voice counterpoint. So let's first perform a harmonic analysis on these. Here's my harmonic analysis in C major. So here's what we have. First a 1 chord, some passing motion going to 6, and then 5-7 of 5, then to a 5-7 in the key, and then a 1 chord. Now that we have those, I'm going to add in the passing and neighbor and suspension, all those non-chord tones. So here's, in our first chord, we have one passing tone there, that D, passing between the members of the chord. We'll move over now to the 6th chord. We have some neighbor tones in the middle voice, circling around that C, and we've got a neighbor tone down here in the bass. Going over to the 5-7 of 5, we've got a little appoggiatura. Now you could analyze that in a couple different ways. If you wanted to analyze it 8th note by 8th note, you could of course consider that the first 8th note of this chord, A, C, E, F sharp, you could consider that a 7 half diminished 7 of 5. I choose to hear that E as a non-chord tone because we'll hear it relatively rapidly. That strikes me as a non-chord tone rather than a structural member of the chord. Then we're over here to our 5-7. We've got a little passing tone in the bass as we go up the scale. And finally we get to our 1 chord and we have a suspension there, forming a 2-3 suspension in those upper voices. A second resolving down to a third when we measure it with those 2 upper voices. So now that we have those non-chord tones picked out, it's a little bit easier to perform some analyses here. So here is, first we're going to focus on the doubled root that we see in the first chord. So focusing on our 1 chord here, right at the beginning of the beat, we have a C, and then it's doubled in the middle voice. So we hear both of those. Now, by the end of the beat, we do have a doubled third. It's there just momentarily and part of passing motion that's going up that scale. So there we see one of our preferences, to double the root if we have the option, and a fleeting doubling of the third that's happening a little bit later on. Now, let's focus on what's happening in the 6th chord. Here's another option that we have. On our downbeat, we have a complete triad. We've got all 3 notes of that 6th chord present. And even though we have some non-chord tones moving around it, those provide the structural emphasis for that harmony. Now, going on to the 5-7 of 5, it's a little bit trickier. So, on the downbeat, it appears, or on the beginning of that beat, it appears like it's just a 7 diminished 6 of 5 at the beginning of that beat. However, as we move onwards, it's revealed to be a 5 of 5 as we go down to the root of the chord in the bass. First we were on the 5th, and then we go down to the root of the chord. And when we have that moment in the second half of the beat, the 5th becomes omitted. However, we hear it still present in our ears because it was there on the beginning part of that beat. So Bach here is helping to flesh out the feeling of the full of this full 7th chord, even though part of it is omitted at different times by arpeggiating it in different voices. By the end of that beat, we also have the C included. That's C, which is the 7th of that chord. So there we have that omitted 5th, but the 7th is present. And of course that C has been in our ears since the beginning of that beat, so we've heard it act like a 7th of this harmony from the beginning of the beat. So there's some subtleties here. We have some implications of some different chords. We have some arpeggiated motion that gives us the sensation that it's a full texture, that we have all 4 voices of the 7th chord present, but they're never actually present all at the same time. In fact, the most number of different voices that we get is at the end, or most number of different chord members where we have the 7th implied, D, C, and F sharp. So there's some different ways that, different tactics that we can use to imply full chords, maybe by arpeggiation or alternating between chord members, so that we get that sense of fullness, even though we only have 3 voices going at one time. Going on to the 5/7 then, we first have a doubled root right on the downbeat, a G and a G, and that's emphasized by the 2nd 16th note. So that we have that sense of doubled root. It's very strong in our ears. So that when we get to the end of that beat and we only have a D, an F, and a B, we still feel like that root is present. I still feel that that's very much a 5/7 chord. I don't hear that as a 7 diminished chord. I hear that as a 5/7, even though the root isn't present at that moment. Its presence stays through there because it was so strongly implied at the beginning. And then we move on to our 1 chord. We have the root and the 3rd at the beginning of the beat. I call it the downbeat here, but it's really just the beginning of that 2nd beat. The root and the 3rd are present. Now we have that dissonance, we have that suspension, which eventually does resolve down to the root again. So the root and the 3rd are present on the downbeat so that we know the functionality of the chord. We've got the root. We've got the 3rd, so we know the quality. And that dissonance just adds a little bit of extra spice. Now, as we go on the 2nd half of the beat, the weaker part of the beat, again, we have a doubled 3rd there. So we've seen this a couple of times in this passage where there are doubled 3rds. But in general, when we see them, they're on weaker parts of the beat, or they are perhaps moving in passing motion. There's no risk of having any parallel issues by having a doubled 3rd like we might if we were voice leading in 4-voice counterpoint or 4-voice chorale style. So here we have a number of different strategies, from our 1st chord with the doubled root, our 2nd chord with a complete triad, our 3rd chord with its use of arpeggiation, our 4th chord with a doubled root, but by the end the root disappears, and our 5th chord, which has a dissonance used in it, and then eventually a doubled 3rd. So there's lots of different ways that we can imply harmonies now. So it gives us a lot of different choices. Of course, this may add some flexibility, but it also adds some challenges. So we'll also work on ways to analyze this music so that it helps us to focus in on what we want to do harmonically. Now, before I leave, leave this example, I do want to focus on this little motive here in the soprano voice. Note how it's very cleverly used in inversion. Note the motivic unity here. So we have that in the bass voice. It's just the inversion of what's happened up above. The 16th notes are going F, up a 3rd, down a step, down a step. In the bass voice, we've got a B, then down a 3rd, up a step, and then arrive. Very clever and very subtle. Very much like we've seen in the inventions, where the X and Y motives, the subject and counter subject, are often interwoven. They're often linked together by similar motivic material.